The wind rolled down from the mountains like a living thing, cold, hungry, and without mercy. Elijah Boone stood on the porch of his log cabin, eyes narrowed against the snowglint, watching the wagon make its slow, creaking approach. The horse's breath steamed in the bitter air, and the driver hunched low, reins in one hand, a thick-gloved finger pointing toward the figure seated beside him. She was smaller than Elijah expected, bundled in a worn wool coat. She stepped down, with care, one hand pressed against her belly, swollen and unmistakable beneath her dress. Elijah's jaw tightened. This wasn't what he paid for. The driver handed off her single trunk with little ceremony. "This here's Clara May Holt," he said, widowed out in Sutridge. "She's yours now, I suppose. Best be gettin' inside for the snow swallows." Why? The wagon turned, wheels crunching, and was soon swallowed by the white. Clara May didn't speak at first. She stood silently, glancing up at the man before her, tall, broad-shouldered, rough-hewn like the mountains themselves. His coat was patched but clean, his face shadowed by days of stubble and a life of hard choices. "You're pregnant," Elijah finally said, voice low and edged like a blade left too long in the cold. "Yes, sir," Clara replied evenly. "Widowed 6 months. My husband died in the mines. I took the contract to cook and clean. That hasn't changed." He didn't answer. He turned instead, boots creaking across the wooden planks as he opened the door and stepped inside. "Come in, then," he muttered. "It's cold." The cabin was modest, a single room, a small hearth flickering in the corner, a rough wooden table, a bed pushed into the far wall, and a cot newly built beside it. Clara stepped in, breath-catching from the sudden warmth. Elijah lifted her trunk and set it near the cot. She watched him work, not unkind, but distant, like a man used to being alone, like a man who didn't know what to do with someone soft. "In his space, you understand this isn't charity," he said, facing her square. "I don't need token, I don't need fixing. I just need the stove hot, the floors swept, and the food ready when I come in. That's what I paid for." Clara looked him in the eye, something strong flashing behind her quiet gaze. "I didn't come here for sympathy either. Just a place to work, and a roof to sleep under. The rest I'll handle." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moaned against the walls. Snow whispered down the chimney like a ghost trying to get in. Elijah nodded once. "You'll take the cot." She nodded in return. "Yes, sir." And just like that, two broken people made an agreement, not of hearts, but of survival. He didn't ask about the baby's father. She didn't ask why a man like him lived all the way out here, alone with only wood and silence for company. That night, Clara cooked beans and cornbread, and Elijah sat in silence by the fire, chewing slowly, eyes on the flames. She mended a shirt at the table, one hand always resting gently on the curve of her belly. Outside, winter kept on howling, but inside the cabin, something small had shifted, something warmer than the fire and quieter than grief. The mountain. Man didn't know it yet, but the woman he paid for would change everything. The snow came heavier the next morning, blanketing the mountains in silence. Elijah rose early, as he always did, and split wood outside the cabin. The air was sharp, cutting into his lungs like a knife. He didn't mind pain. Pain kept a man grounded. Inside, Clara had already lit the stove. She moved slowly, carefully, hands steady despite the weight she carried. She was boiling water, mending his shirt by the hearth. The smell of coffee, real, strong, honest, filled the air. "Didn't expect you up," Elijah muttered as he brought in another armful of wood. Clara looked over her shoulder, a faint smudge of ash on her cheek. "Didn't expect to sleep past dawn. Habit from the boarding house." He dropped the wood beside the hearth. "You ever work a farm?" She shook her head. "My daddy was a bookkeeper, then a drinker, then gone. My husband was a miner. Not much land in their lives." Elijah grunted. "Lot of mouths talk, but few hands work. You look like you've done both." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Had to. Widow, don't eat unless she works." The silence stretched between them again. Comfortable, familiar. He sat at the table, hands rough and scarred, reaching for the mug she'd just poured. "You keep your name?" he asked. "I kept everything worth keeping," she answered simply. That answer settled something between them. Not friendship, not trust, not yet, but a beginning. Over the next few days, they moved around each other like old wolves in shared territory. Clara didn't ask questions. Elijah didn't offer explanations. She cooked, she cleaned, and when her strength flagged, she sat by the fire, knitting small things, a hat, a sock, a blanket for the child inside her. Elijah, for his part, spent more time near the cabin than usual. Something about the way she moved, calm and deliberate, reminded him of a time before everything went wrong. Then came the night. She nearly collapsed. He had just come in from stacking wood when he found her gripping the edge of the table, face pale and drawn. Sweat beaded her brow. One hand clutched her belly. "Elijah," she said through gritted teeth, "it's not time. I just need to sit." He was beside her before she finished the sentence, easing her into the chair like she might break apart. Panic prickled in his chest, the kind of panic he hadn't felt since the war. "Do I need to ride for a doctor?" he asked, voice lower than usual. No, she shook her head. Just the baby pressing. Happens sometimes, I'll be fine. He hovered awkwardly, unsure. He was a man of action. Wood, stone, muscle. But her pain made him helpless. That scared him more than any gun ever had. I'll make you something, he said. Tea or something. Clara managed a weak smile. Just sit. I'll be all right in a moment. So he did. He sat across from her, watching her breathe, watching her stomach rise and fall. That child was coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And he realized then, with a cold weight in his gut, that he wasn't ready. Not for screaming, not for blood, not for life. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, Elijah sat alone at the table. A half-carved cradle lay in front of him. Curls of wood scattered across the floor. His knife moved slowly, carefully, as though shaping the wood might shape the future to. The fire popped behind him. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, for the first time in a long time, he felt something different. Not loneliness, not dread. Responsibility. And, maybe, just maybe, something like grace beginning to stir in the cold heart of a mountain man. The days passed in a rhythm as slow and steady as snowmelt on a pine branch. Elijah rarely spoke unless necessary, and Clara didn't press him. In that cabin, silence wasn't loneliness, it was survival. Words were rationed like salt or flour. Too many, and something might break. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the scrape of a spoon against a pot, the soft hum of Clara's voice as she mended clothes or hummed to the life stirring in her belly. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, Elijah could hear her whisper to the child, "Your mama's gonna be all right. Little one, you hold on, and I will too." He never mentioned it, just lay still in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening with something tightening in his chest that he didn't have words for anymore. One afternoon, Elijah brought in a bundle of soft pine and birchwood, not for the stove, but for something else. He sat up near the hearth and began to carve. His hands, worn and scarred, moved with surprising gentleness, like he was remembering something long forgotten. Clara watched him from the table, folding laundry. "What are you making?" He didn't look up. "Cradle, for the baby." "Can't think of another reason." A pause, then a small smile tugged at Clara's mouth. "I didn't expect that." He shrugged. "Figured the floor wouldn't do." She hesitated, then said, "Thank you." He paused his carving, glanced up at her, and nodded once. "You're not alone here, Clara. I reckon I should act like it." The cradle came together, piece by piece, curved legs, slatted sides, a hand-sanded frame. Every night, Elijah sat by the fire after supper and worked on it with quiet focus. Clara began knitting a small quilt to line it, her fingers moving in rhythm with his knife. One night, as she stirred stew over the fire, she asked, "You have any children, Elijah?" He didn't answer right away. The knife slowed in his hand. "No," he said finally. "Once had a woman, a long time ago. Before the war, didn't work out." She turned slightly toward him. "What happened?" He stared at the fire. "War happened, came back. Different." She didn't wait. There was no bitterness in his tone. Just fact. Like a man talking about a storm that took a roof, something that couldn't be helped. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. He looked at her for a long moment, then returned to the cradle. "You seem the type who stays," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "I didn't get a choice in leaving." They left it at that. The first time he heard her laugh, it startled him. It was late. He was trying to heat milk for her by the fire, and promptly spilled it all over his boots. He cursed under his breath, hopping back, and when he looked up, Clara was laughing, full, sudden, and warm. He blinked at her, stunned. "I'm sorry," she said between chuckles. I needed that." He rubbed his neck, grumbling, but a corner of his mouth twitched. "Suppose you think I'm useless." "No," she said, smile still dancing on her face. "Just human." Elijah sat back in his chair, watching the fire. Something settled in him, not comfort, exactly, but the slow uncoiling of a tight knot that had lived in his chest for years. That night, the wind howled against the shutters, but the inside of the cabin was warm. Clara stitched a name into the corner of the quilt, Hope, while Elijah finished sanding the cradle. Neither spoke, but something had changed in the fiver ELIGHT. Not just survival, something like trust, something like the beginning of a family. Asterisk, the sky broke 3 days later. What began as soft flakes turned to a driving, sideways snow that swallowed the trees and blurred the mountains to nothing but white shadows. The wind screamed like something ancient and angry, rattling the cabin windows and pressing frost against every crack. Elijah had seen storms before, mean ones, even deadly, but this one had teeth. He secured the barn, double-checked the chimney, and brought every last stick of wood into the cabin. Inside, the fire roared, and the air grew thick with the smell of pine smoke and boiled beans. Clara stayed near the hearth, her face pale and tight with discomfort. She hadn't said much since morning, but Elijah noticed the way her hands kept finding her belly, gentle, protective, worried. "You all right?" he asked, leaning over the table. She nodded, though slowly. "It's different today. Pressure. like the babies settle in lower. Elijah pulled out a chair, it too early. She gave him a half smile. Few weeks, I think. But babies come when they choose, not when we do. The wind banged against the shutters, hard enough to rattle them. Elijah frowned. Let's hope this one's patient. By nightfall, Clara was doubled over near the stove, her breath coming fast and shallow. Elijah, she gasped. I think it's starting. He was beside her in 2 strides, arms steadying her shoulders as she sank onto the cot. His hands shook. Damn it all. He hadn't expected this. Not now. Not in a storm that would trap them for days. All right, he said, voice gravel low but firm. You've done this before. What do you need? She grimaced through a contraction, then exhaled hard. Water, boiled, clean cloths. And Elijah, I need you to stay calm. He blinked. I'm calm. You're not. She tried to smile, but pain stole it away. He got to work. Water boiled on the stove. He tore up one of his old shirts for cloths. He laid out blankets and stoked the fire higher than ever. But when Clara cried out, something inside Elijah cracked. He'd heard men scream in war, watched them die with blood pouring from their mouths. But this sound, this raw agony, was worse. Because he couldn't fix it, couldn't shoot it, couldn't stop it. All he could do was kneel beside her and offer his hands. I'm here, he whispered. I won't leave. She gripped his hand like iron. You better not. Hours passed. Time turned strange, lost in waves of pain and breath and heat. Outside, the world was all wind and white. Inside, it was a battle of its own. Clara fought like hell, gritted her teeth, screamed once, then again, her body trembled with effort. Sweat soaked her hair. And Elijah, he stayed by her side, whispering, words he didn't know he still had in him. You're doing good. Just a little more. Just a little longer. You ain't alone. Then, finally, a cry, high-piercing, alive, a baby red and squalling, slipped into Elijah's hands, slippery with life and miracle. He stared, stunned, tears brimming in his eyes before he even realized they'd come. It's a girl. He whispered hoarsely. Clara, she's perfect. But Clara didn't answer. Panic surged. He turned to her, her head lolled back, face ashen, chest barely rising. Clara, he called. Clara, stay with me. She moaned faintly, eyelids fluttering, but she was conscious. Barely. Elijah moved fast, wrapped the baby tight, pressed blankets around Clara, fed the fire like it was a life itself. All night, he sat between them, one hand cradling the newborn, the other resting on Clara's. He didn't sleep, he didn't breathe. Easy, not until morning, when sunlight cracked the clouds and the storm finally gave way. Clara stirred, her eyes opened, weak, but clear. She all right? She rasped. Elijah smiled through red eyes. Both of you are, and for the first time, he felt what he'd been missing all those years in the mountains, purpose. The storm was over. Snow glittered outside the cabin like white glass, high enough to bury the porch rails, and the world was hushed in that strange, sacred silence that only comes after something violent has passed. Inside, the only sound was the soft, steady breath of a newborn child. Elijah Boone sat beside the hearth, one arm curled around the tiny bundle wrapped in flannel and wool. The baby's eyes fluttered beneath her lids, lips working silently as she dreamed. She was impossibly small, no bigger than the space between Elijah's elbow and wrist, but in his arms. She felt heavier than a rifle, heavier than any load he'd ever carried. He didn't know how to hold something so fragile. His hands were built for axes, ropes, rifles, not babies. And yet, she fit there, perfectly, like she belonged, like she had always been meant for him. Clara slept still, deep and unmoving. Elijah had checked her breathing a dozen times before he finally allowed himself to sit. She had nearly died. He knew it. He'd seen that color in a person's face before, right before death took hold. It haunted him now, burned behind his eyes, and yet she had survived, and she had given him this. Not just a child, a beginning. Elijah looked down at the baby again. You don't know what you've done, do you? He whispered. His voice cracked. He turned everything upside down. Little one. He glanced toward the window. A hawk soared high above the trees, silhouetted against the sharp blue sky. You came in on a storm, he said softly, and I reckon you're going to carry that wind in you your whole life. She shifted slightly, her tiny fist curling near her cheek. You're yours, he said. You belong to her, but if it's all right with you, I'd like to belong to you both. His voice broke. He bent low, resting his forehead against the baby's soft crown. And for the first time in over a decade, Elijah Boone cried. The next evening, Clara stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, confused at first, then filled with realization. Elijah, he was at her side in an instant. I'm here. The baby, she's fine, he said quickly, sleeping now. She's strong, Clara, strong, like her mama. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I wasn't sure I'd wake. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. I wasn't sure either, he admitted. You scared me. There was a long pause, thick with things neither of them knew how to say. Then Clara whispered, I heard you talking to her. To the baby, Elijah looked down. I didn't mean for you to. I'm glad I did. Her voice was soft, but full of something real. Hope. That night, they sat together by the fire, Clara in the rocking chair, Elijah beside her, and the baby in her arms. The cradle Elijah had built waited nearby, smooth and hand-carved, lined with the quilt Clara had stitched in silence. The baby slept between them, peaceful and warm. Elijah stared into the flames. "You got a name for her?" Clara nodded. "I do. Thought of it when I felt her first kick." He waited, watching her face. "Her name is Grace," Clara said, "because that's what she gave me." "What she gave us." Elijah swallowed hard. He nodded. "It fits." Outside, the snow began to melt, slow and silent. Inside, something else was thawing too. A hardened man, a grieving widow, and the new life that stitched them together. Breath by breath, moment by moment. Her name was Grace, and she had already saved them both. The mornings changed after Grace arrived. They used to begin in silence, Elijah waking before dawn. Boots on cold floors, breath fogging in the early chill, a pot of bitter coffee boiled over coals, still glowing from the night. Before not now they began with soft cries. Sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears, but never with silence. Elijah had never known what it meant to be needed every second of the day. Grace demanded everything: food, warmth, comfort, arms to hold her, voices to sing her still. And Elijah found himself giving more than he ever thought he had. He learned to swaddle with awkward hands. He learned the rhythm of a newborn's cry, the difference between hunger and loneliness. He learned how to rock a cradle with his boot while whittling with one hand, and stirring a pot with the other, and he learned, slowly, that love could grow in the smallest of ways. Clara healed slowly. She moved with care, always tired, but there was a strength in her now, not just the strength of surviving childbirth, but the strength of watching a man become something more than he thought he could be. One morning, Elijah was standing at the stove, carefully spooning mush into a bowl when she spoke from the cot behind him. "You're getting better at that." He turned, sheepish. She only spit up once. This time, Clara smiled, cradling Grace in her arms. "You're a natural." He chuckled dryly. "I'm a mountain man. Clara, ain't nothing natural about me holding a baby." "Funny," she said, "because she looks more at peace with you than anyone I've ever seen." Elijah blinked, then looked down at his hands, the same hands that once held rifles and rope and the weight of too much memory. Now they cradled a bottle, a blanket, a life. He nodded once. "She's changed me." Clara's eyes didn't leave his ear, letting her the days pass like that, in warmth and small joys. The snow slowly melted from the rooftops. Birds returned to the trees. Elk tracks appeared on the edge of the woods again. Elijah chopped wood with Grace in a sling across his chest. Clara laughed the first time she saw it, the big man with the little girl tucked against him, both scowling at the sun. He built her a rocking chair for the porch. Just because. She baked him a pie from dried apples and a pinch of cinnamon she'd saved all winter, just because. Neither of them said what they were building, not out loud, but the shape of it was growing, clearer with each passing day. Not a contract, not an arrangement, but something more. One evening, Clara stepped out onto the porch with Grace bundled in her arms. The sunset painted the sky gold and rose, and the mountains stood like gods in the distance. Elijah was already out there, smoking his pipe, watching the last of the daylight fade. "She likes the light," Clara said, sitting beside him. "She's got your eyes," Elijah replied. They were quiet a while, listening to the wind rustle through bare branches. Then Clara asked, "You ever think about leaving this place?" He didn't answer right away. "Used to," he said, "before you got here now. This feels like the only place that makes sense." She smiled, looking down at Grace. "It does to me too." That night, Elijah lay awake in his bed, the cradle beside him, the fire low. He realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't running from a memory. He wasn't mourning a life he'd lost. He was living with them. And if the mountains were his church, then Clara and Grace were his prayers finally answered. Spring came late in the mountains, but when it arrived, it did so with quiet determination. The snow melted into thick patches of earth, the creeks ran high and fast, and the first signs of green pushed through the thawed ground. Elijah Boone, once a man who lived with one foot out the door and both eyes on the edge of solitude, found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He stayed, and more than that, he started building. It began with a garden, not a big one, just a patch beside the cabin, where the sun hit strongest in the morning. Clara mentioned it once, absently, while rocking Grace on the porch, how nice it would be to grow herbs, maybe some carrots and beans. Elijah nodded. The next morning, he turned to soil. He dug with a rusted spade and blistered hands, pulling roots and rocks from the hard earth. Clara offered to help, but he shook his head. "You grew a whole person," he said. "I can grow a few vegetables." Clara laughed, and Grace cooed from her arms. The next day, she planted marigolds along the edge to keep the bad spirits away. She said with a wink. After the garden came the lean-to. Then, a new chicken coop. Elijah fixed the roof, added a shelf for Clara's books, and built a second cradle. This one for the porch, so Grace could nap in the sunlight. Every nail, every board, every shovel of earth said the same thing. I'm not going anywhere. Clara knew it. She saw it in the way he touched things now. Not like a man borrowing a space, but like someone settling into it, claiming it, letting it claim him. One morning, she found him carving something into the post. Near the front steps, she watched him from the doorway, the baby quiet in her arms. Later, she went to see what he'd written. 5 simple words, carved with the careful hand of a man who never wasted one. Home, we weigh you, my dot. They made no perfect sense, not lined up that way, but the meaning was there. Jumbled, maybe, but true. Clara pressed her fingers against the carving and felt her eyes sting. One quiet afternoon, as spring rain pattered against the roof, Elijah sat in the rocking chair, holding Grace against his chest. Clara was making stew, humming an old church hymn under her breath. Elijah looked over and said, "Been thinking, maybe I ought to add another room. Give her space when she's older." Clara smiled softly. "She won't be alone in it forever." He raised a brow. "No, she'll have siblings, won't she?" Clara asked, voice light but eyes steady. Elijah didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Double quotes. "If that's the life you want," he said, "I'd be proud to give it." Clara set the spoon down, walked to him, sat beside him on the arm of the chair, head on his shoulder. Grace slept between them, warm and safe. "I never came here looking for love," Clara said quietly. "I came here looking for survival, but you gave me something more. You gave it first," Elijah replied. "I just didn't know how to name it then." The rain stopped by evening. The world outside shimmered, silver and green, new and clean. Elijah stepped onto the porch, arms folded across his chest, and looked out across the land, the trees, the garden, the trail leading down into the valley. He had wandered a long time, fought hard, lost more than he could say, but here, at the edge of nowhere, with a widow, a child, and a home he built with his own 2 hands, he had finally planted something worth keeping. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Boone wasn't just surviving the mountain. He was rooted in it. 3 years passed. The mountain didn't change much, not on the surface. The pines still whispered in the wind. The creek still roared after a rain. Snow still crept in early and melted late. But at the old cabin tucked between those rugged hills, something had changed. Life had taken root. Where once there had been silence, there was now laughter, a little girl's bright, fearless voice echoing across the yard as she chased chickens barefoot, curls bouncing, cheeks red with joy. Grace Boone was wild and sweet, just like the storm she'd been born in. She had her mama's eyes and her papa's stubborn streak, and she had a way of softening even the hardest of hearts, especially Elijah's. Elijah still rose before dawn, same as always. He chopped wood, fed the animals, and walked the ridge to check the traps. But when he came back now, a small voice met him at the gate. "Papa, you find anything?" Sometimes he had a rabbit or two, sometimes nothing. Either way, Grace was thrilled because what mattered wasn't the catch. It was him coming back. Clara would be on the porch, apron tied, smile waiting, hand resting on her second belly, swollen now with another child. Elijah always gave her a kiss before anything else. It was quiet love, mountain love, solid and lasting. That summer, Elijah built a bench under the aspen tree near the creek. It was Clara's favorite spot. She'd take Grace there in the afternoons with a basket of strawberries and a blanket. They'd read or nap, and sometimes Elijah would sit with them, whittling toys or just listening to the wind. One evening, as the sun bled low over the ridge, Clara turned to him and said, "Did you ever think it would be like this?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said simply. "Not once." Clara looked down at Grace, asleep in her lap, clutching a carved wooden bird Elijah had made her. "It's more than I prayed for." He nodded. "Me too." Grace was named well. She had given something back to both of them, something quiet and sacred that neither had known they were missing. For Clara, she had been proof that life could still grow from loss. For Elijah, she had been the hand that reached into his wilderness and pulled him back to the world. One morning, as Grace sat in the dirt planting beans with her tiny hands, Elijah watched from the porch. His thoughts wandered, as they sometimes did, to the war, the pain, the long years of silence, the man he used to be, and then his eyes settled on her, the child he didn't ask for, the woman he'd hired out of practicality, and the home they'd built with blood, fire, and second chances. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and walked toward them, the dirt, the garden, the child. Grace looked up, eyes wide. "Papa, you want to help?" He knelt beside her, took a handful of seeds, and smiled. "Yeah," he said, "I do." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara curled up beside him, her head on his shoulder. "You remember that ad you posted?" she whispered. "The one that brought me here. I remember. You asked for someone to cook, clean, keep the stove hot." Elijah looked down at her. "Didn't know what I was really asking for." She smiled. "What were you asking for, Elijah?" He glanced at Grace, asleep by the hearth, then at the belly where another child stirred. He took Clara's hand and kissed her fingers gently. I was asking for a reason to stay, and in the end, that's what he got. Not just a woman, not just a child, but a home, a future, and something he thought the mountain had taken from him forever.